Good luck. Okay, everyone, good luck. So I guess we're online now. Is that correct? Yes. Welcome to everyone that's on the panel today. It's so nice to see your faces uh, in Technicolor. Let's see, is the translator here?
Yes, alive and kicking.
Okay.
Yes,
So
alive and interpreting.
we're
Okay.
Well, today is going to be an interesting discussion, in my opinion, because of the backgrounds of everyone that is here on the panel. We all have different involvement in independent radio. I think that's fair to say. Is that correct? With everyone, I mean, everyone on this panel has connections with independent radio. And Today's discussion is, I'd like to go over the description of the discussion again, so that we can sort of, concisely frame how we're going to move forward, if that's okay. Um, Independent radio or podcasting as a tool for radical political and cultural subversion, and as mediums to help re-examine the hegemony of mainstream through radical storytelling and programming. So that is the subject heading. As we delve deeper, hopefully during this discussion, we'll draw from the experiences of all of you and myself within these mediums, and we'll distill how ongoing social and political problems are there, how we'll deal with those, and how we can act as agents of change. We'll discuss how these mediums can present fresh narrative perspectives as counterweights to the dying capitalist realist framework. I use that term broadly based on the description given by the theorist Mark Fisher. That's where I'm drawing that particular term, which essentially says that, quoting Frederick Jameson and others, that it's easier to see the death of the world and the end of capitalism. So based on that, we'll focus on localized, contemporary, and historical examples of independent radio. I used pirate radio as an example in this because it has had such an amazing history in the world, in terms of how it was a subversion of these airways that were often being pumped out by regimes and those in power. And then we'll expand it to include the possibilities of podcasting. In my own work, I've really taken to podcasting and producing podcasting in the last 2 years, since the pandemic was I guess March 2020 is when the onset of it all. And I believe that in my sort of jump into podcast production, that I saw how underutilized it was as a radical possibility for production. And so with that, I'd like to say that just a really quick, I'd like to introduce our guests, our panel. Mary Mikaelyan, you're based in Yerevan and in Cologne, is that correct? Yes?
Yes, now I'm in
Okay.
Cologne.
You're in Cologne now. Okay. Eleni, Poulou, where are you based? Are you in Berlin? Where are you based?
I'm based in Berlin, but also in Athens, but mainly in Berlin.
Okay.
But I do radio in Athens and Berlin, and also in London.
And Nino Davadze, you're in Tbilisi?
Hi, I'm from Mutant Radio, currently from Tbilisi.
Okay.
Great to
Okay.
be.
So I could go on more. Your descriptions, your bios are incredible. But I think that would be nice, because it's clear that we're all part of the independent radio landscape, that we should just jump right in, so that we can have this discussion. I'd say, first of all, I would like to know personally a little bit about how each one of you got into independent radio. I mean, I see in the bios that you're involved, but what was it that drew you to independent radio? I think we should just go. We'll start with Mary, if that's okay.
Yeah. Hello, first of all. Nice to meet you all. I can start by saying that, like, I work as an artist, and as an artist in my practice, during the recent years, I've been interested in different types of structures, which sometimes seem unreachable or inaccessible can seem so by certain people, as it requires some other forms of operation, which operates also through quite also bordering and exclusion. This is also about media in general, no? And that's why I like the idea of setting up different sorts of this kind of structures, like be it a space, be it a library, be it a radio. So in this way, like the idea of a radio was always there as me and my friends were working. And then during it actually came into existence during the lockdown, the first months of the lockdown, when together with our friends from Tbilisi, artists from Tbilisi, Alexi and Mariam, we had the idea that we need to do it together. And that's how Radio Antenna came to life. So developed in collaboration between Armenian and Georgian artists. So between us and yeah, basically it started in 2020 during the pandemics, which was quite a time, as you know, for as an extreme form of isolation. And we thought that we need to communicate with friends who are in distance, and in this moment when you are imposed on this extreme form of isolation, that any type of connection with others, contact with others is thought to be that you need to be cautious. So that's why we thought we can create this two channels of transmitting, broadcasting from these two cities, Tbilisi and Yerevan, in our own way, as it seems that there is not much communication between the cities, though we are quite near, and there is only like mostly communication in a more personal level. But we know all that this has not been always the case. So, yeah.
Was
Maybe.
Yeah. That was a chance to expand that conversation, if you will.
Expand, and also to get in touch with each other in through sound. So it's not about we can say creating some kind of a dialogue, even if it's incomprehensible sometimes, because we can use sounds that can be in languages that we don't understand. But as it is more also about experimenting with sounds, so there is this kind of dialogue, but which is not always understandable in terms of language. And yeah.
I would definitely, I want to return to this idea of sound. This is a very important concept because, as we know, this is the medium that we're talking about, you know, and how that engages the imagination and other things in ways that the visual mediums don't. So moving on, Eleni, can you tell us a little bit about how you got into radio?
Sure. I was born in Germany to Greek immigrants, and I lived in a small town. And to access any type of culture apart from magazines or books, you would have the radio. So I would not only learn sounds like music, which was an important cultural, occupation, but also information. Like I remember calling the radio stations and asking them, "Hello, I live in a small town. Can I do this? Where can I find this? How can I do that?" And it was from there that in those days we didn't have internet. We still had to do radio on tape and tape it together and splice it. We were allowed to
You're
do
dating
something
yourself.
It's the way it is. So we were part of a local radio station, which was still part of the state radio, of course, but it was a bit open. We could sort of do what we want. It just had to include one interview. And then pirate radio became very important to find out about new music and information. If you got into a new town, you would then first find the pirate radio station and see what is going on here, like especially in Greece or England. And I think when I do radio now, I still think of myself being isolated there and having this window into the world. And if only one listener says, "Tonight I felt less alone," then that is why I do it, to connect people all over the world.
Amazing. Amazing. And yeah, pirate radio has also been a very important part of my life. I would say I want to know more about how Nina got into radio. Can you tell us?
Hi. So Mutant Radio was there already when I started to collaborate with them. But first time I decided that I want to be connected with the radio was during the Tbilisi Architectural Biennial 3 years ago. They launched in Georgia, and with some other side projects, they also launched a temporary radio station called Common Waves Radio. And this radio mostly spoke about the architecture, common spaces, and what these spaces mean for building modern societies. And the Common Waves radio included these radio stations from Iceland, Argentina, Europe, and some Asia, some Chinese radios. And that was beautiful. I was managing just the Instagram social media page, nothing connected to the pure radio job, but I got impressed because I had to listen to write the captions, and I was impressed by how audio world can be so pure media-wise, because it's like it lacks the visual, so it leaves the less space for the judgment, less space for the assumptions or the conclusions. You just hear it, and just you have space to think about it and kind of reflect on it from your kind of honest side. And I really wanted to be the one who speaks in the radio and who kind of sparks this inspiration, just kind of discusses and considers the topics, but never pushes people to kind of believe in something. I don't know, just to explain it in a really naive form. And later I started to record podcasts at home. I was mostly discussing the albums or the artists that kind of changed the whole understanding of electronic music scene or just the musical scales itself. I really wanted to speak about music and kind of have some introductions before I would kind of advise someone to listen to the music. And I sent this recording in Mutant Radio and asked them like if it's possible to kind of have this kind of show in the Mutant Radio. And at the end, for now, I'm an author and host in the radio podcast, City Kids, and mostly I speak about female musicians and social movements and how this kind of overlap in Georgia and how we work on social growth from a female perspective when it comes to the Georgian case particularly. And on the side, I also discussed the global tendencies and how we also synchronize with them. And apart from the hosting, I currently took over with some other programs and curation and selection. And I should say radio never disappoints me so far. It's been like 2 years already. And it feels like, it's quite new still. And Yeah, that's a magical space for sure. But this is shortly what I do for Mutant. Yeah.
That's beautiful. There's so many things that you have all brought up that the brain is firing. I want, sound and what that means. I mean, we can get into whole sorts of side discussions because of this idea. Let me talk about sound. Before I start to get into some of the more substantive questions related to the actual topic, but do you think that sound and as you're describing it, Nina, a new experience, if you will, in terms of how you've evolved as a media consumption creature, if you will, how did everyone in this panel, because I can relate to this, when we started to listen to sound and focus on sound, did new ideas or could you conceive of new futures in terms of what this might mean for generations today and moving forward when you had that experience of the aha, oh my God, like the sound means so much more for my intellectual pathways because of what it stimulates. Is that something you can all relate to? And so tell me more, like I would say, again, going through the panelists, Mary, when you decided to connect to this idea of sound being that platform for connecting and even through beyond language, tell me more about how you see sound being something that can help us move forward in these discussions about storytelling, about dissemination of information, and about communication.
Yeah, from where I think, I wouldn't as much probably think about putting sound next in the frame of, as you mentioned, the intellectual way of thinking, like, or in general thinking. So because sound has much more in it than we can put in the way of transmitting communication, transmitting knowledge, and actually it is much more about I would like to think about as a way to think about in general sonic practices, which are not always about information and knowledge, which can be quite oppressive systems. And I want to think about the acts of listening themselves, to what we are listening, how we are listening, whom we are listening, and how this can appear in, as this is something maybe that I'm saying as an artist, but how it can appear in the research or practice in generating or activating some common senses and also spaces. So, for example, now I'm thinking that I change quite the, as I change the city, it also changes the level of sound and the sound environment, as in Yerevan it is much more a high sound environment for me, and this is like gives the possibility to think about sound, what does it convey apart from the content. So now where I am, it's quite a low sound environment, which is from where I stand quite can be a form of oppression also, but I try to think in another way about this low sound frequencies, not that can not reveal also much about our bodies, about ourselves, about our anxieties. Yeah, maybe like this.
So it sounds
more.
in this way, it sounds, not to use the word sound, but it seems as if it is the idea of the transmission of the sound and the listening of the sound are ways to push through new experiences that if I'm understanding you correctly, take you out of the intellectual realm and place it more in terms of experience and and the possibilities of distilling these information, even about a city and about a soundscape, through the transmission, as opposed to the discussion of things, or the need we seem to have to encapsulate things and to put words to them, and to, so it seems as if you're describing something that moves beyond the systemic ways that we have of analyzing things.
Yeah, probably we can say so, but also, you know, the possibility of the radio, as it is something very at the moment existing. For me, I think that it gives the a possibility that people who do not meet in the reality, in the real life, can come to meet through the radio. So in this way, I also think about the sound, that it's not maybe as much about the information or transmitting something, but just the opportunity of creating the situation and creating relations. I want to think about and work with radio in this way, as itself an opportunity, a potential to for different places to come to existence, different relations to appear, for even for a restricted time and restricted area.
Opening it up to Eleni or Nino, what do you have responses to that? Like, I would like to include you in
Sure.
this.
May I ask, Mary, what do you mean by sound? Do you mean like sound that you generate? Do you mean field recordings? Do you mean you go out in the street and capture the sounds there, or do you generate a sound with instruments? May I ask?
Now I was thinking about sound in general, which is not also connected probably maybe with only radio, but general sound, but it can involve much, as the
sound
recording,
on the street,
as environment, as the space where you are when you meet with your friends and you just maybe simply listen to music. Even you can that you want to share this practice of being together, having a conversation together, and just this experience of listening to music or the sound, which can also come from archival footage. So it has much different layers and can take different shapes.
Nina, I'd love to hear from you about sort of what you're thinking about that, because as you were describing your own practice and the things that you're involved in, and even the way that you got involved in it, there is it seemed to me that there was a little bit more, there are a little bit more specifics in terms of how you see sound playing out in your own practice. Could you elaborate a little? Yeah.
I should mention that apart from the radio work, I'm a musician myself, working with field recordings and noise and experimental music and production itself. So my perception of sound, that kind of feels privileged at some point to be on both sides of as a producer of sound, but also who communicates this with the wider audience. And I think nowadays it's important to know the both sides, otherwise the whole industry is it gets quite tricky, isn't it? So I don't know, it's quite a big topic, but what I see it from a radio person perspective is that like day by day our perception becomes a little bit greedy, how we fulfill the inspiration, and we get kind of ensured that we need multimedia kind of reflection on certain topics to get it all. We need the visuals, and for example, some cinemas they touch like water and that kind of specifics, right, to feel it all. But I think at some point it is even opposite. You need to maybe split the materials and get just like really pure one line out of it, to leave the space for your perception, for your individual reflection in the process of listening. And also radio is quite I don't know, the ethical media, I would say, because it simply you can just turn the radio on in the kitchen and you can do your thing without losing too much time, but also get the new inspiration out of someone. So it's really like active. It's kind of reader, reading a book kind of thing. So I think it just keeps you active without taking too much from you. And I think it's really healthy communication with the listeners. And this is how I perceived it. This is why I wanted to work in the radio, because I feel like this is the less selfish media, which is quite rare and difficult to get nowadays, because we are spoiled with screens and like new senses and everything. This is where it's going. But radio is quite flexible in that sense too. This is why I believe that radio can not just can survive in a modern sense, but it can offer you completely different alternative where you are safe as a person, which is this is the media which doesn't really pushes you to decide what to think, but it just gives you a rhythm and flow to kind of do your thing, but also being a part of that wider audience to also listening in that radio at the same time. So this is kind of audio ritual for me that kind of completes this mental process with the listeners. And it's not just about the news or information, but when it comes to the experimental radio and the music and sound listening, it also, I don't know, for example, in Mutant Radio, we also try to give a new sense of a new perspective of sound and how that can be listened and how that can be collective experience. So that's a whole new theme, which can be quite transparent, but also flexible to modern era. So that's quite wide. I don't know if I
No, you did. No, that's beautiful. I would also ask that we make a distinction here.
Yeah.
Because historically we can talk. One of the questions I had asked you in an exchange I had before we got on was this idea of there are two forms that we're really talking about. There's terrestrial radio that relies on transmitters and the physical beaming of signal, and that's all dependent on a lot of environmental factors. Then you have the online radio. Now, both require programming. In other words, like the idea of in both of these settings, the idea is that there is implied some sort of structure in terms of how you are transmitting the actual shows or ideas that you have. So there are segments, if you will. This happens in both online settings and terrestrial settings. Before we move on to the online side, one of the questions I had for this group was whether you think terrestrial radio, the FM, is it dead? Do we believe that this idea of the younger generations have come up on online radio? Okay, I happen to be a transition in my life of the two, in terms of I started with the terrestrial form and have hybridized and moved on into sort of a weird space of both. But do we think terrestrial radio is dead, not just in the sense of its death as a form or not, but do we think that it has the possibility still to engage people now, the younger generations, and moving forward?
I think it depends on how it will pan out, the situation. Of course, there will be times when there is no internet and you will have to convey important information, like in a war or something. So FM will still be needed. From the programming side, because of their restrictions and censorship, like me, I can do what I want in my radio shows and I can build my own community. I can decide who is my guest and what music do I play, what do I talk about. You can never do it on our terrestrial radios. But in the past, that's why we had pirate stations. So if people can still access the FM, I think it can have a future, because in some areas only that can be reached, So yeah, I think it will not completely die out, but it's less relevant.
Anyone else feel something about this? Do you feel like that this is you know, I would say that in my travels, I can just to add to this that I know that in terms of the basic infrastructure, radio still tends to be a much more viable means of transmission in so many different, like I'd like to use the
On the
term
ocean,
global.
you can hear
Yeah,
FM, you know, like when
exactly.
there's no Wi-Fi anymore, so it will not die.
I mean, so
it's still important.
infrastructure matters in places around the world in which, like, I lived in Lebanon for 15 years, and you know the electricity is non-existent now in Lebanon, and so the idea of the FM radio station both is problematic because of that, and it's possible because of that, because you know generators allow for these things, whereas you know the internet, that can be a very controlled medium in a country depending on who has like power over that telecommunication. So I would suggest personally that I don't think the terrestrial radio is dead. I think that it has the possibilities to still have efficacy in many locales, and it does. It's still if you do the research, it's still the number one way that people get information is through the radio, FM radio, terrestrial radio. So I suggest that it's not dead, but I'm curious to know how we think it might move forward in ways that create more relevance with younger and younger users who are so dependent upon the screen, who are so dependent upon these other, as Nino was calling, multimedia aspects around this. Nina?
Here in Berlin, our one FM that is still free because you cannot make more FM bandwidth, still transmits our community stations like Cashmere, which I'm part of, Reboot FM, so everybody gets 1 day on the FM. So we can reach people who would normally not listen to us, like when they're driving to work or something, you know, that type of thing. So I think that could work if people share one FM signal.
Nina, I just was, I wanted to know if you thought, had any opinions on this.
Yeah, just to, I don't know, I would not question that much, or I would not make it complicated, because I think once the CDs were out, for example, people would never ever think about the vinyls would come back as a cool gift to give to someone. So you never know. I guess if the only thing the FM stations can do is to think about the relevance of the shows and the topics, and I don't know, the connections with the new generation through the topic and the idea, rather than the infrastructure or the format of the radio stations. I don't know if I can consider myself as a new generation. I think I'm a millennial. But if I go in a different city and I travel in a different country and I sit in the taxi, even though I love my playlist, I always turn it off and ask a taxi driver to let me listen in a local radio, just to get to know what's happening, where am I? And if I want to kind of still reimagine my living time in UK, I still listen to the BBC Six, and this is the way I kind of travel in time. And I think if the radio, the FM, I'm terrestrial, that's what we call, if this kind of relevance will be there, I think we don't have to worry about it. I think it will still have this kind of, at least the sentimental, nostalgic kind of attitude, which is also enough. It's not a death for sure, because I think people always would have this kind of attraction to the radio. It's always something special about it. It might not be that massive, which is not a tragedy, and it's also okay. I think generations change, and it's not it's okay, I guess. But yeah, once again, my friends started to buy this little vintagey pastel radios and put that in the kitchen. And I think it's kind of still goes in a spin, and it comes back, because generations come with the new technologies, but they also get tired of the technologies, because humanity is quite descent thing, and people need to get around with it. Doesn't really matter what's the time requirement and what's the tendency of multimedia live today. But that's my opinion. I think we should just keep flowing with the flow, and it will, yeah, as I said, it's the most ethical media, so I think it will never get lost, for sure. It will change the shape, but it will be there all the time, I guess, and we don't need to worry about it. I don't know, that's my optimistic vision about it.
I'm happy to hear it. Mary, I'd like to hear more about like what you think.
I think that we often think about the online or the internet as if it is given, but very often it seems to be very open, but it's not the fact. So to get to somewhere in the internet, you really need to know that, while these other forms of media, so if we use that word, they are more locality like oriented, and it always has the place. So even it's like it works with specific local area, specific restricted area, but it is working. I mean, we also like we have a group of who work also on the hardware part of the radio. So we were experimenting also with the building transmitters with very cheap materials, how we can transmit in a certain area, which is, can be also illegal if you pass different measure or kilometers, or I don't know, like
Sure.
transmit. But we have been experimenting quite a lot with the physicality of the medium, as we also work in using the format of radio inside specific places, as it can be like an exhibition space. So we also experiment like how the physicality of the radio transmission can happen inside a specific space. So I think it is much interesting, because it is really that with very cheap and accessible things you can build up your own broadcast, and it can be powerful.
I would also like to add to that one of the things that has clearly happened over time is that through whatever means was possible through the production models, that things have become more accessible. The technology has allowed for a more horizontaling effect of media and cultural production as a result of, because if we talk about terrestrial radio in terms of the radio station, we can talk about a massive infrastructure that implied, and the tools were inaccessible. You would have to go to the station to have access to these tools. It seems that we all have some sort of background or familiarity with music and music production, myself included, that I've noticed over time how much more accessible it's gotten for us to be able to do all of this production in our own bedroom, in our own personal spaces, which I think also expands this conversation. The idea that because you're describing also, when you're building cheap materials, using cheap materials to build some of these real world transmitters and things like that implies also another set of concerns in terms of how you produce and how it's broadcast and where it's broadcast. The internet also provides a different set of concerns, in that we have all these tools at our disposal in ways that we didn't, that almost look like you're creating all the kind of radio things that you do in your own home setting. So I'd like to take this moment to sort of turn towards the other aspect of this discussion, which is the podcast, and the idea of the podcast, because a lot of the podcasting implies exactly what you're talking about: access to the ability to produce in very localized settings, to be able to transmit certain things. I would like to know what everyone's opinion is when we talk about podcasting. What I can say from my own idea of modeling and why I consider it as an underutilized resource in terms of, sort of radicalizing the process is that, the podcast implies that it's up online, that it is accessible to anyone that has access to that through the internet, and it can be listened to at any time. Whereas a radio station has programming, so there's this idea of the fixed programming schedules that you have to tune into based on those schedules. Podcasting allows for the individual to self-serialize, if you will, this listening experience. They can listen, they can stop it whenever they want, they can pick it back up whenever they want, they can there's all sorts of elements to it that also create a sense of freedom within your own life to be able to continue to have that experience. I would like to know what everyone thinks about podcasting in terms of how it has, especially during the pandemic, because we can all say that a lot of the audio things that we're talking about seemingly increased in engagement during this period because of, as Mary was talking about, the isolation of this period. Is the podcast something that you see as more open-ended, or does it have the possibility to be more radical in form than it is currently? Anyone?
I think especially with podcasts, even though with our online session like Mutant, Cashmere movement and so on, we can upload the episode and people can re-listen and stop in their own time. Podcasts can definitely touch on more radical subjects, political wise. There are podcasts about pornography or things like that you would not find in normal scheduling. And I think there is space for them to be now a bigger part of people's life, thanks to the pandemic, when people really started getting into it and realizing maybe they can do their own. So I think it will democratize the landscape.
Does anyone else have anything to say about this? I'd love to hear from you in terms of like podcasting as potentially being more radical than it is, which is my contention, because I see it as I think it's been a lot of what we talk about, ends up becoming this thing that you transmit in whatever way, whatever format, whatever structure. It very quickly can be incorporated into these neoliberal models of marketplace and valuation in certain ways that I find to be just repetitions of the same structures that have been guiding us to these places that we've moved into. And so when I look at podcasting, I think about things like, how can podcasting address issues of security in places where people are vulnerable, and if they want to get this information out? I think about how will people be able to produce this? I think that one of the beautiful things about podcasting is that if you have a decent phone and an internet connection, you don't need all this massive amounts of production gear. You can literally do these things in those ways. And I started to think about, okay, so if you wanted to challenge systems, or if you wanted to challenge, let's say, the powers that might be oppressing a situation, or that might be restricting a situation, how does one do that? It's hard to do that in the terrestrial form. Pirate radio was one of those things that allowed for that. Of course, there's the anonymity of that, but podcasting, thus far, the way that I've been seeing it evolve, while we can talk about the risque or the more the subject matter that might not necessarily find itself on radio airwaves, I wonder if you have opinions on what that might imply in terms of people's ability to be safe in these situations. And do you see podcasting as a way to challenge these norms?
I can probably say that yeah, why not? Podcasts can be a tool as all the media. So it can be radical, but the thing is that we need to be radical so that we can use all these tools that are there with alone or with friends. So it's just needs, if we want to be radical, we need to challenge the whole dominant logics, which is something that needs to overturn the whole system and the whole logic. But in this sense, it actually in radio and this kind of independent making of podcast, it allows, of course, it allows the space to contest and resist dominant ways of creating and reproducing narratives, because what media in general does, it's like it has the power to give voice or to cut it in specific situations or to frame it and simply otherwise, or to make it invisible, or in our case inaudible, certain things, certain people, certain practices. That's why independent radio, and in this sense also podcasts, can be a powerful tool to open up a space for concerns and the needs that we have, and that has nothing to do, has nothing in common with the mainstream media. One thing that I like about the momentarity about the radio itself, that it's as me and my friends with whom I work, we don't consider it as a media itself, but more as a space for creating relations. One problem that I can find with this online storing of podcast is that it often can depend, as everything online space can depend on some ratings and individualized playlists. It can be also kind of very dependent on this all the time. Like you create your own ratings, you create your playlists, but there should be a way to communicate also, not to share all these things, not to store it on your, like, I'm listening to this, only this is my selected podcast, selected playlist. But it is interesting to open, to share. Maybe you get influence from some other people. That's how I look at it.
And I think also the way in which a lot of podcasts have to be broadcast, like on Apple or mainstream things, that is problematic. For example, our station Cashmere, we want to move away from Facebook, Instagram. We want to leave these channels, but where do we go? We have to use Google Drive. We want to move away from this, but what do we use instead? So trying to find ways to broadcast really freely without any of these companies being somehow part of it, that is maybe the future for us, to be more radical,
Nina,
actually
sorry.
No. We have to use Mixcloud, and you know how that is, and like you said, we have the stats, and it's not truly free, is it? We are part of these companies.
Go ahead, Mary, please.
I wanted to say that we also, as we often think about this kind of the infrastructural thing, we also started, as I said, we were experimenting with the hardware itself, but we also started to work on our own way of streaming. So, for example, to be able to, as we know some coding and we know how to, now we can organize our streaming ourselves, and to make it easy to store the broadcast, to record it, and using open source software like Icecast servers and Liquid Soap. So we are also interested how this can become a way to work with it also.
This is something very specific that I definitely was hoping to get into, this idea. In my own conception of the podcast, the reason I brought up security is simply that I know through my own work in organizing and telling stories about communities that have been affected by different power structures, that security is a legitimate concern in these places. And so I thought about how to create possibilities for anonymity, and it did involve exactly what you're talking about, Mary, which is like coding your own players, finding places within the infrastructure out there to host things in ways that are not tied into larger companies, but more are tied into like hacker collectives, other places in which they are also very mindful of that ability to create safety in terms of storage even, and so is that not one way that we can conceive of new futures when we start to engage younger and younger generations who, as I see it, and as the world continuously is taxed by these global systems, scarcity is one of the things that has happened through the last 2 years. Everyone talks about the fact that there have been supply side shortages, and you can't get this and you can't get that. So scarcity is something that we're talking about. How do we, in conceiving of being able to use sound and all of these things that we've been talking about moving forward, to confront certain things or to connect people, I see this as one way, that concrete way in which we can discuss about these concepts of infrastructure and creating viability for independent broadcasting. How would we get the word out to people? Because the idea is that Spotify, Apple's, all these people have the resources and the means to create reach. Do we want, like Nino was saying something about, it's not necessary that it becomes so widespread, and that we can still have power and efficacy in smaller divisions. Do we want to only quarantine the possible effects in these ways, or do we still want this idea of creating more of a mass effect outside of the mainstream ways that occur at the current time? Do we want to have more power? In other words, like this idea of internationalism, right? In the past, in revolutionary movements, this idea of internationalism was a very important thing, to know that you weren't alone, that in different parts of the world that you shared experience, and that was a very important thing. And I see that as a means of engaging that idea moving forward. But how much reach does one have to have in terms of getting your ideas out to the world? Is that something that is important? Does that make sense? The question is, do we? The question is, do we? Does it? How much reach do things have to have the power to transform things?
I think it's more dependent who you have to reach. I think, yeah, it's more about which part of the people, which group you're focusing on. But it depends. I think radio should not measure the growth or the size of the volume of the influence in numbers. I think it's not all about that. But at the end of the day, today everything is countable. Like, yeah, we watch the number of likes and everything. So in some sense it matters, but I don't know, that's really complicated topic, and it's really depends on which format we focus on, who and how we measure the effect. I think even the small media with the really small amount of listeners can affect. I think, for example, me, as a host, I'm not going ambitious about the numbers, but at the end of the day, at the end of my kind of the podcast, I'm thinking like, if I affected or changed the mind of a one listener, that's enough. That's more than enough. So yeah, I think changes start from the I don't know, one person, one individual. It's just more about how sustainable it is, like what we work on exactly, which change are we talking about, rather than the numbers. But at some point, numbers come too. It's like we are not ignoring that. But yeah, let's think about that one person first, maybe, and then the numbers will become relevant. Yeah, that's my answer.
I agree. I think what I like is when, of course, we reach let's say I'm a musician too. You have the certain people who will follow you and listen to what you do. But it's more interesting to have a space where people who would not usually find what you do come. For example, at Cashmere, people can come to a physical space. And recently we did a show at Radio Vilnius, which is on the street. So people walk past you and see you in the kiosk and say, hey, what are you doing? And get into a conversation. So I think it's more important to also find people that normally would not listen to that type of thing, or might never go to a museum, or you know what I mean. And that's how you can build the next generation.
I mean, do we see that? I mean, do we see that the world of the audio world that we're describing, do we see that as in itself a challenge to a lot of what's going on with the mainstream? I mean, Nina, you talked about how the it's a more what did you call it, ethical, what did you call it, a more ethical form of media. Can we all expand on that a little? Why audio has maybe that ability, and the transmission of audio has that ability to continue to make things fresh for people, as regardless of the flows of media and how it works. Why audio has a special quality in these areas?
Well, I think it's not about challenging the mainstream, because it's quite difficult to challenge it as there's a lot of technological outcome out of it, right? There's a lot of reasons why mainstream is the mainstream the way we have it today. I think it's more about creating the alternative, whoever needs it. And it's not about, well, if you grow the number of listeners, that's a great thing. But I mean, radio was never a television, for example, which is more watched or listened than the radio, right? It's more about it has its audience. People who needs a radio, they should have it. And I think it's also okay to give up the idea of being in the center of the mainstream or something like that. This is the whole pretension, which doesn't have to be there when it comes to the modern radio or even the FM. I would not say the same about the podcast, because I think podcasts can have a pretension because it's growing like virally nowadays. So I think podcast it's a little bit different from the radio, a little bit transformed version, right? But in terms of the radio as a pure form of the radio, I think, yeah, I would not say it challenges the mainstream, but it kind of creates this audio underground for the people who needs this kind of alternative space to think about alternative stuff. So it definitely the strength empowers that people, but I think, I don't know, my modest opinion about it, like radio cannot go mainstream today because we see that screens take over fairly. I don't mean like it's bad or something, like it's like, yeah, it's quite practical, so why not? But radio as such, it's quite decent, different, quite I don't know, characteristic, and I think it should not really compete with the mainstream, but really should kind of create this kind of different alternative space for someone who needs it. That's quite enough, I guess.
Mary, do you have any opinions on that?
I agree quite with what Nina and Eleni were saying before. With the numbers, that it's not something about numbers, but it's it has completely other dimensions. So we should give up thinking about using this tool from this perspective. And as Nina is saying, I agree that we should not think about replacing or being in the center or demanding to be included in the mainstream or something. It's not about this, but it's about the presence, first of all, for me, the presence and the possibility that it can bring about something unexpected, as Eleni was saying, like in the street, maybe some people just approach and be there. If the radio wouldn't be there, this thing would not happen. So it has happened a lot like this, that just the existence, the presence of it brings something unexpected. And I think if we think like this, then we can see really the where the potential of it lies, and it's. I believe that its potential is in the possibility of helping in decentralized connections and movements, which are often made invisible or just non-existent. It just can help in this.
So I think we're all in agreement that we don't like the idea of the reaction to the mainstream, the idea that what we're doing in terms of our conceptions of radio and the audio world, that we're not, that the point isn't to be the reactionary modeling to the mainstream, because that's, as Nino was implying, that's sort of a futile effort. The idea is the mainstream is going to exist as it does and evolve in the ways that it does, often driven by massive resources, corporate power, and all of the other implications that are there. But the idea is to extract yourself from that process and create, if you will, parallel forms of media, so that as we all know, we all had our own individual doorways into radio, into this medium. That what then is fantastic about the fact that all of this is still living, podcasting, independent radio, is that what the idea is constantly, the way that it lives is that it creates things for people who are interested in those things to be able to plug into. Is that fair to say? Like is this, do we find that to be a sort of accurate description of how this moves forward? Even the idea is that as long as we have the means to take things that we're interested in and find value in them outside of this idea of competing with the mainstream or dismantling that thing, that we're there as a resource in some way, as a connective tissue in some way for these different elements that exist, so that people do you find that, though, that the one like the online thing, that the idea that this can be a global community, how does that feel to you? Like, describe that in your own minds. What do you think that means for the future? I mean, that global community where we might not be able to be physically with each other, but somehow we're connected. Does radio, how are you seeing radio as the thing that might be independent radio, podcasting? Is that, I mean, do we see that this is still really what we're aiming for in some way, like global connection?
May I speak? I think it's really important that we have this now, as long as we have the tool of the online media. We also do radio exchanges. We have done one with Radio Antenna and with radios all over Eastern Europe, where we can, now that we couldn't travel, or maybe we cannot afford to travel anymore because flight prices are changing. Or also for people who are sick, let's say have MS or so and cannot move. This will be a very good tool to spread ideas around the world. And like we are now connected, us who are sitting here, I think this will continue, and that will bring change, because we can very quickly relay information and get together and change something within a week. We could organize a festival now and do something, and it would have a reach in our communities, the people we know. Where you live, where I live.
I think we're getting towards the end of this, but I would like to ask, because one of the things that was sort of implied in the talk was this idea, you used the word change. Are in conceiving of new futures, as these things move forward, independent radio, podcasting, yes, we're not trying to react to the mainstream, but is there a sense that some of this is derived, or there's this idea that we want things to change? Is there this idea that the audio world and how we produce things is necessarily creating some change in the situations that in the systems that we all exist within?
Of course. I think it's all about it, right? Yeah, the whole way the radio works, the format the radio gives the material to the listener, it's all about change, nothing else but the change. So of course, yeah, no discussion from my side from it. Like, of course, at least like this is my personal reason why I'm there. But yeah, others might have a different answer. But yeah, for sure.
I'm glad. I mean, that's heartening. I'm just, it's hard to gauge how people's motivations are in these areas. So, the idea, some people might not want change to occur through this process, so for you, change is something that's implied in your actions within this. But I mean,
might don't want to change. What do you mean in there exactly?
Well, what is the question then? Is you're trying to change what?
Well, it's not about like it's not like I'm trying to change something. It's just the whole process. It's not like I see the problem and I think radio will solve it. It's not like that. It's the space to have the whole process transparent in there. We just talk about, like, discuss the radio. This is the space to go through the process. I think it's quite difficult to aim to change with not with just radio, but whatever it can be. I think nothing can be sorry, nothing can be the exact answer or salvation nowadays. I think we need to have this kind of multiple media to make it. I think radio has its own job, to own space, to kind of give the space for discussions. I think it's really difficult to put the responsibility on certain people, on certain kind of media. I think it's all about the process, what we do. I mean, if I see the problem, I just talk about it. I don't really have this ambition that now I'm gonna go in the radio and we'll change the world. It's not like that. I think it's really difficult to be that ambitious today. But
does that mean that we discourage that in others? I mean, well, I'm a little confused. The idea for me would be, yes, when you say you want to change, we're not talking about, as we were discussing earlier, a reaction to the mainstream, but people also can have the space, if they want, to feel like change is necessary. Because let's talk about oppressive environments in which war and all of these other, like, I think that it should be fair that people come in and say, I want to change something, and this is a way that I can do it through the radio. So it sounds to be a limiting factor if people aren't also given the idea that change. Why is it limiting?
Yeah. Why it's limited?
No, I mean, I'm saying, I'm you're the way that you're expressing the idea of change, it can't. You're saying that it doesn't have to be explicit, but also we can have the space for it to be explicit in these areas as well. That is my only point.
Yeah,
Like the
it
idea is
doesn't
that
exclude. It doesn't exclude for sure, but I
that's
think
that. Yeah.
but
That's all. That's the only point I was making.
yeah, it doesn't exclude the idea of like massive change, but I think it's really I don't think it's right to measure the value of the radio of by the influence of on the change or something like this. I think radio can just like follow the points of the discussion and mark the right topics. But I think it's change. It's all about the listeners, what we hear, how we hear. So that's already enough to have a space for discussion. And I think, yeah, it's not up to radio to make a huge, massive social upside down social situation. I think if it happens, it happens, and radio might be there like the starter, fire starter. But I think value of the radio is just the space for discussion, space for sound. And then I think we should just give it a chance to find its own way. I think it's really difficult to put any other responsibility on it.
I like that. Does I guess wrapping it up, do you know, we haven't talked a lot about the cultural elements of I think the last thing I would just like to discuss a little, because everyone as I conceive on this panel is, you know, music is such a big part of all of our lives in terms of how that is distilled. And I wonder if you know, in terms of our own ideas of valuation of things, that whether, you know, music and these other kinds of things that are non-spoken, how can we incorporate, how are you incorporating some of these things in your own practice in terms of how you're conceiving of your own programming, and how you're conceiving of how that might affect your listeners? In other words, like rather than just engaging in sort of like the intellectual discussions that happen, how are you seeing other forms of audio and cultural transmission being a part of your own practices in radio? Does that make sense? I'm sorry if it's not clear.
Yeah, I think it's clear. Shall I go again, if it's all right?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, in our case, as we have a physical space and it's a Mutant radio, that means that we can stream on Facebook as well. That lets us to be absolutely interactive with the audience and bring up the quite recent cultural, social topics, and also have this kind of discussion in a meanwhile with the audience. I think that's the best way maybe to reflect on to stay relevant. Yeah, just to put it in a short way. Yeah, I think interaction, that's quite I don't know, necessity for the influence. And I think FM, maybe in the old times people would call in the radio, right? I think nowadays
right, yeah,
to call. So I think either the physical space where people come and listen to the radio show together and then they discuss it in a meanwhile, or after the show with the host, this is the space for discussions. Or still the social media. I think interaction with the social media, it's also a necessity if a radio has a pretension that it is a game changer or brings up the alternative space. I think, yeah, social media and the online networks, that's quite important to bring up also in the media channels. So yeah, that would be the answer.
Is anyone else?
Also inviting people to play live, or also sometimes I play live myself and collaborate, and then find ways to transmit that. Like we said before, people feel less alone because they think, oh, I make similar sounds, and then they send you their music. So then you play it next time you play, and then it goes from there, you know. So you are in You can give your email address and people can send you music and you can transmit it. And that is a feedback loop that is different. But I wanted to say back to the very early days of radio. With Cashmere, we were part of an exhibition in Munich called Radioactivity, the old days when it was a political means of propaganda or subversion and resistance. So I think, luckily in Germany, I'm not in a position where I have to do that, but you never know. In some ways, forever, it will be a tool for that, to spread ideas and information, like to survive.
Mary, do you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, I would want to add on, like, agree, and that also with what Nina and Eleni were saying about the space, physicality of space, and sharing this experience of making the program together, or thinking how you can share your time and this temporality of being together, and also with some open number of people who can join you. You don't know, you don't close it, but it's open that someone can come up and can join you. So I like to think in this way. It is, yeah, it has this nice thing that it is open to in unidentifiable number of people. But also if we think about any kind of change, we all know about the radical use of radio in different periods of time, in different societies, in different cities. But what I would say from my own position is that if we think about the changing the whole in the whole logic that is inscribed in our societies, which are based much on violence, devastation, and different hierarchies and domination, we also need to think about the way of doing anything that we do, the whole process that we do, and for this, I was thinking that I would say that we also need the radio to be able to not broadcast it, to not go on air, to be quiet also when we don't feel right. It would happen a lot that, for example, after the war, we would go quiet for quite a long time. And this is something that I feel now it's quite important to think about it and talk about it, as kind of try to not be to be aware of our own physical limits and to go beyond the pressures of meeting some expectations of doing the programming of the radio, or being like depend on the pressure of people around us to whom you need to prove something. So this possibility of not producing and to not broadcasting, of being quiet, is something that I would think in the way of thinking about change.
Well, my takeaway from a lot of this is that I see a lot of vibrancy on the panel in terms of how everyone is conceiving of their own engagement in this process, and that gives me a lot of hope. It gives me a lot of it allows for me to think very much so, based on the topic at hand, that none of this is dead, that very much we have things to look forward to in terms of how this can be shaped. And that I love the idea that everyone on the panel, as I distilled it, we're not trying to react to certain things, rather we're trying to take our own ideas and the communities that we're involved in and find ways of amplifying that. And I love the idea of the interactivity. The interactivity, to me, from this discussion is something that I find could be incorporated more into the idea of moving into these new futures. And that, like Nina was saying, there used to be the phone call, this idea, but this idea of how the possibilities of creating more interactivity as things are being broadcast, as you know, whether it's chats or however it could manifest. But the idea that this interactivity is a wonderful way of making what is broadcast living in that way. And so I want to thank everyone so much for. I know this was a very big topic, and hard to distill a lot of these ideas into specifics in ways that, because we could talk about these things forever. But I think that I can say personally, I really appreciate hearing from all of you in terms of how you're engaging, and it makes me want to know more about how you all will be engaging in the future. So I look at
It'd
this
be
as
nice
an
to stay in
introduction.
touch, maybe, and
Yes,
find out what we do. Maybe do something together. That'd be lovely. Nice to meet you,
I mean,
Mary. Nino,
it's
Jackson.
yeah. I'm
Yeah, the
very
same.
inspired by all of you. I am very inspired by all of you, and it was really nice for me to be able to go into your bios and to see some of the things that you were doing. I'm sorry I couldn't talk. We don't have the time to talk more specifics about the things that all of you are doing that are
But we could do a
inspiring
radio show
individually.
together.
That'd be awesome.
Yeah.
In any case, thank you, Nina. Thank you, Eliana. Thank you, Mary.
Thanks
I
so much
appreciate
for
it.
having us.
And really, it was fascinating to talk to you all and to hear your perspectives.
And nice to meet you, Jackson. Good luck on the road.
hopefully the listeners got to get a sense that yes, indeed, there are ways to move into the new futures together, despite all of the things that we might be contending with these systems that are at hand. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you for having us.